Chapter 1, The Veil of Shadows. The grand estate of Hawthorne Hall sat perched on the edge of a dense forest, its ancient stone walls covered in creeping ivy, as though nature herself sought to reclaim it. Inside, preparations were in full swing for the wedding of the century. The bride, Emily Blackwood, was a vision of grace, her white dress trailing behind her like the mist that gathered at the edges of the trees. She stood in front of the tall, antique mirror in her dressing room, adjusting her veil, but her reflection unsettled her. The room seemed colder than it should have been, the shadows long and unnatural. The air held a strange weight, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She glanced back at the mirror and gasped. For a fleeting second, her reflection was wrong, her eyes had been hollow, her smile grotesque and twisted. But as she blinked, the image returned to normal. "It's just nerves," she whispered to herself, though her hands trembled as she smoothed the silk of her gown. She turned to her maid of honor, Claire, who sat nearby fixing her own hair. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Claire asked, not looking up. "You're just jittery, Em. It's your big day. Everyone gets cold feet." Emily tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. The house had been in her fiancé's family for generations, a sprawling estate filled with history and secrets. It was beautiful, yes, but also ancient, and something about its darkened halls and faded portraits made her skin crawl. Still, this was her wedding day, nothing was supposed to ruin it. But as she left the dressing room to head downstairs, the light flickered, and for a brief moment, the hallway was plunged into shadow. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure, standing just behind her. A tall, dark figure, cloaked in shadow. When she turned, it was gone. Chapter 2, The Wedding March. The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom, a vast space with vaulted ceilings and chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of roses, their delicate fragrance masking something darker, something metallic. Emily stood at the entrance, her father by her side, her heart pounding not with excitement, but with a growing sense of dread. As the music began to play, she took her first step down the aisle, her veil casting a soft blur over the guests' faces. They all looked so distant, their smiles stiff, their eyes vacant. She wondered if it was just the veil, but when she blinked, the eerie sensation remained. Her fiancé, James Hawthorne, stood at the altar, looking as handsome as ever, though there was a strange pallor to his skin today, as if the weight of the house's history had finally settled over him. His eyes were fixed on her, but they seemed distant, unfocused. Emily's stomach churned as she walked toward him, the whispering of the guests growing louder with each step. Except, no one was talking. Their lips were closed, their smiles frozen. It wasn't the guests. The whispers were coming from somewhere else. Somewhere unseen. She slowed her pace, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The air seemed thicker now, harder to breathe, and the room felt colder. As she passed the old portraits of the Hawthorne ancestors that lined the walls, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It was like a chant, ancient and rhythmic, but she couldn't understand the words. Her eyes drifted toward one portrait in particular, a woman in a dark gown, her eyes wide and filled with terror. The painting seemed different from the others. More alive. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the ballroom, extinguishing several candles along the aisle. The room dimmed, the chandelier's light flickering. Emily froze, her eyes darting around the room. For a brief second, she saw them, shadowy figures standing behind the guests, their forms dark and formless, yet unmistakably human. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to continue. James was waiting, his expression unreadable. But as she reached the altar and took his hand, his skin felt cold, like marble. His grip tightened, almost painfully, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but darkness. Chapter 3, The Vows. The priest's voice droned on, the words of the ceremony lost to Emily as she stared into James's eyes. The world around her seemed to blur, the guests fading into indistinct shapes, the room warping as if the air itself was bending under the weight of something unseen. "Do you take this man?" The words echoed in her head, but they seemed wrong, distorted. James smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was something darker, colder, as though something else had taken his place. Emily's heart raced. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling her ears. drowning out the priest's voice. She could barely breathe, her chest tightening as though invisible hands were pressing down on her. Her hands trembled in James's grip, and she felt a chill run through her body as he leaned closer. "Till death do us part," he whispered, his voice low and hollow, like the wind through a crypt. Suddenly, the chandeliers above flickered violently, and the room plunged into darkness. Gasps echoed through the crowd, but no one moved. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the whispering voices that seemed to surround them. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of light, of safety, but all she saw were shadows, shadows that moved, slithering along the walls, creeping closer. And in the darkness, she saw them again. The figures. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on her. James squeezed her hand again, harder this time, pulling her attention back to him. His eyes had changed. They were no longer the warm brown she loved, but black, empty, void of life. And his smile. That smile was wrong. Twisted. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she finally understood. They weren't saying vows. They were calling to her, pulling her into something far darker than marriage. Chapter 4, The Spectre's Kiss. Before she could scream, the shadows erupted from the walls, swirling around the room like a storm of darkness. The guests sat frozen, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes wide but unseeing. The shadow figures closed in, their twisted forms flickering in and out of sight, their whispers now deafening. James pulled her closer, his grip like ice. "You belong to me now," he whispered, but the voice was not his. It was deeper, older, filled with malice. Emily wrenched her hand free, stumbling back, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows followed her, slithering across the floor, reaching for her with long, clawed fingers. She turned to run, but the figures were everywhere now, their forms melting into one another, a mass of darkness that consumed the light. In the midst of the chaos, she saw the woman from the portrait again, only this time, the woman was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. She pointed at Emily, her finger trembling. Emily's throat tightened as the whispers surrounded her, the words finally clear. "Join us. Join us." She backed away, but the shadows pressed closer, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. James reached for her again, his face now twisted, monstrous, his eyes glowing with a sickly light. "No," Emily cried, her voice hoarse. "This isn't real." But it was. Chapter 5, Till Death Do Us Part. Emily ran, her veil tearing as she fled from the ballroom. The shadow figures followed, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. She stumbled through the darkened halls of the estate, the air thick with the smell of decay. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with the same terror she felt. She reached the front doors and pulled them open, but the air outside was just as thick, just as oppressive. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted trees like skeletal hands reaching for her. There was no escape. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, but no one was there. The shadows swirled around her, pulling her back toward the house. And standing in the doorway was James, his face pale, his eyes black as night. "Till death do us part," he whispered, his voice echoing in the night. The shadows consumed her, pulling her into the darkness, and Emily's scream echoed through the empty halls of Hawthorne Hall. The wedding guests awoke the next morning, their memories hazy, their minds clouded. No one remembered the ceremony. No one noticed the missing bride. And Hawthorne Hall stood silent once more, waiting for its next victim.